On a winter night in 373 BC, the ground of ancient Greece began to tremble. In the prosperous city of Helike, strange columns of light were reported in the sky. Before dawn, a catastrophic earthquake struck, followed by an immense tidal wave that swept inland across the coastal plain. By morning, the capital of the Achaean League, a city famed for its sanctuary to Poseidon, the very god of earthquakes, had vanished completely beneath waves and silt. An entire metropolis was erased, leaving only a chilling legend in its place. For over 2 millennia, the story of Helike haunted the ancient world, a cautionary tale of divine retribution that many believe inspired Plato's own narrative of Atlantis. It became a ghost story, a myth buried under layers of time. But what if it were true? What if the physical remains of this lost city were not in the depths of the sea, but somewhere else entirely, waiting for a modern investigation to distinguish fact from fable? Now, let us open the case file and begin the investigation. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must journey back from the moment of destruction to the world that existed before it. Long before its name became synonymous with cataclysm, Helike was a vibrant nexus of power, culture, and faith in Greece's classical age. Its position on the fertile coastal plain of Achaea, overlooking the Gulf of Corinth, was a source of immense strategic and economic strength. This was no peripheral settlement, but the undisputed capital of the First Achaean League, a powerful confederation of 12 city-states. As its leader, Helike was the League's political and judicial heart. Its assembly halls were where delegates convened, its courts were where disputes were settled, and its name was attached to treaties that shaped the destiny of the entire northern Peloponnese. Its authority was respected, its voice carried weight, and its future seemed unassailably secure, built upon centuries of tradition and influence. This influence was physically manifested in silver and bronze. Helike's independent coinage is a crucial piece of evidence for us today, a tangible assertion of its economic might. The designs, most famously, a striking portrait of the city's patron god Poseidon wielding his trident, were not just currency, but powerful symbols of civic identity that circulated throughout the Greek world. This prosperity was built on a dual foundation, a bustling port that welcomed traders from across the sea, and the rich alluvial plain that consistently yielded agricultural surpluses. This potent combination allowed the city to support a large, thriving population, to fund impressive public architecture, and to maintain its political dominance. To its neighbors and rivals, Helike was a formidable bastion of stability and wealth, a city seemingly under the eternal protection of the divine. However, Helike's true significance transcended politics and commerce. At its very core was a spiritual identity centered on the great Panhellenic sanctuary of Poseidon Helikonios. We must be clear, this was not merely a local temple. Much like the sanctuaries at Delphi or Olympia, it was an institution of international repute, a sacred destination for pilgrims, athletes, and emissaries from across the Hellenic world. It held a special, almost parental, importance for the Ionian Greeks who had migrated centuries earlier to Asia Minor, but still viewed Helike as their ancestral religious home. Ancient writers, from Homer to the geographer Pausanias, attest to its sanctity. Within its sacred precinct, its temenos, stood a magnificent bronze statue of the sea god himself, an artistic masterpiece so famous it was said to be the model for a sculpture later erected in Rome. Here, in the shadow of the Earthshaker, intractable disputes were resolved and the most solemn of treaties were sworn. This sacred status may have ultimately bred a fatal arrogance. Later, Roman-era accounts, attempting to rationalize the disaster, tell a story of profound hubris. It was said that Helike's leaders had refused a formal request from Ionian colonists for either a copy of their famed statue or the architectural plans for the sanctuary. In another version, they murdered emissaries at Poseidon's own altar. In the ancient mindset, these were grave acts of sacrilege, a direct insult to the god. This narrative of divine retribution was seemingly confirmed by a series of unsettling omens. The writer Aelian documented a mass exodus of creatures 5 days before the disaster. Snakes, weasels, and mice fleeing the city for the safety of the mountains. While interpreted as a supernatural portent, we now analyze this account through a modern geophysical lens. The behavior is consistent with animal sensitivity to the subtle foreshocks, the release of radon gas from the ground, or the minute fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field that we now know can precede major earthquakes. The city was a nexus of immense wealth and sacred power, yet it stood on catastrophically volatile ground, deaf to the warnings that heralded its absolute obliteration. This was the world that vanished, a complex, powerful, and devout center of civilization, about to be reduced to a 2,000-year-old mystery for centuries after its destruction. The ghost of Helike lingered just offshore. Roman tourists, including the geographer Pausanias, wrote of taking boats out onto the Gulf of Corinth to gaze down through the clear water at what they believed were the city's submerged ruins. They described the tops of buildings and, most evocatively, the great bronze statue of Poseidon standing upright in the depths, a hazard to fishermen's nets. This powerful image cemented a legend that persisted into the 20th century. Helike was a purely submarine site, a Greek Atlantis resting on the seabed. This belief guided early explorers like Jacques Cousteau in fruitless deep-water searches. The city was hiding, but everyone was looking in the wrong place. The primary evidence was, in fact, a red herring, a memory distorted by time. The truth of Helike's location was not a mystery of the deep, but a puzzle buried under the land itself. The investigation required a fundamental shift in perspective, a move championed in the 1980s by archaeologist Dora Katsanopoulou and scientist Stephen Soter. They returned to the ancient texts not as literal maps, but as collections of observations needing interpretation through the lens of geology. They noted that ancient writers described the site being covered by a poros, an inland lagoon. Their revolutionary hypothesis was that the tsunami had not simply submerged the city in the deep gulf, but had inundated the coastal plain, creating a temporary, brackish lake. Over subsequent centuries, they argued, sediment carried down from the surrounding mountains by rivers would have filled in this lagoon, gradually pushing the coastline outwards and burying the city's remains deep beneath a new layer of terrestrial soil. If they were right, the search for Helike had to move from the sea to the shore, a daunting task across a vast and featureless plain. This began one of modern archaeology's most patient and methodical quests. The Helike project, launched in 1988, was not a treasure hunt. It was a slow, painstaking forensic analysis of an entire landscape. For over a decade, the team worked without finding a single definitive ruin. Their primary tools were not shovels and picks, but geological drills and advanced remote sensing equipment. They drilled hundreds of boreholes, pulling up long cores of sediment that allowed them to read the history of the landscape layer by layer. When we analyze these cores, we see a story of repeated inundations and depositions. They use techniques like magnetometry and electrical resistivity, tomography, to search for anomalies beneath the surface, the faint signatures of buried walls and buildings. It was a systematic grid search for a ghost, sifting through meters of silt and clay deposited over 2,300 years. Then, in 2001, after 13 years of relentless searching, came the breakthrough. A borehole sample from a plain near the modern village of Rizomailos, several hundred meters inland from the Gulf, brought up fragments of classical-era pottery mixed with destruction debris. The team focused their efforts on this area, and in excavations the following year, they unearthed the first definitive proof, the foundations of a building from the 4th century BC. They had found it. Helike was not in the sea. It lay 3 to 5 meters below the modern surface of orchards and farmland. The discovery vindicated the team's hypothesis completely. The legend of the submerged city was true, but the location had been misunderstood. The sea had indeed destroyed Helike, but the land had then entombed it. With the site located, the full story of that catastrophic night could finally be reconstructed from the archaeological evidence. The excavations revealed a chilling tableau of destruction. The ruins of the classical city were found buried in a thick stratum of sand, gravel, and clay, dense with the shells of marine microorganisms like foraminifera. This was the unmistakable forensic signature of a high-energy tsunami deposit, a blanket of seabed debris carried inland by a massive wave. But the evidence pointed to a 2-stage disaster. Beneath the tsunami layer, the building foundations themselves told a story of violent shaking. Walls were sheared, and entire structures had sunk deep into the underlying soil. This points us to the cataclysm's primary mechanism, soil liquefaction. The coastal plain where Helike was built consisted of soft, water-saturated sediments. When the earthquake of 373 BC struck, the intense seismic shaking would have increased the water pressure in the soil, transforming the stable ground into a turbulent, liquid-like slurry. The city, with its heavy stone buildings, literally sank into the earth. This explains the ancient accounts of Helike being swallowed up before the wave arrived. The earthquake delivered the first devastating blow, destabilizing the very ground the city was built on. The subsequent tsunami was the final, entombing act. Further excavations revealed an even deeper, more sobering truth. Below the classical city lay the ruins of an even early Bronze Age settlement, destroyed by a similar seismic event around 2200 BC. The investigation proved not only what happened to Helike, but that its destruction was just one chapter in this region's long and violent geological history. The evidence, gathered from deep within the earth, allows us to close the case file on Helike. We can now say with certainty what happened on that winter night in 373 BC. The catastrophe was not a single event, but a rapid, devastating sequence. First, a massive earthquake, likely originating from a fault line just offshore, violently shook the region. This seismic shockwave triggered two near-simultaneous effects. On the coastal plain, the waterlogged alluvial soil underwent liquefaction, turning to slurry and causing the city's heavy stone buildings to sink into the ground. At the same moment, the quake likely caused a huge submarine landslide on the steep underwater slope of the Corinthian Gulf, displacing a massive volume of water and generating the tsunami. This wave then swept inland, inundating the already sinking city. This two-stage model, liquefaction followed by inundation, perfectly reconciles the scientific findings with the ancient descriptions of a city both swallowed by the earth and overwhelmed by the sea. The rediscovery of Helike is more than just the solution to an ancient puzzle. It is a landmark moment for archaeology. It represents a profound victory for the scientific method, demonstrating how a legend that had drifted into the realm of myth for over 2 millennia could be brought back into the light of history. Helike is no longer a ghost story. It is a tangible place, its destruction a measurable geological event. Its legacy is deeply intertwined with the most famous lost city of all, Atlantis. Plato wrote his allegorical tale just a few years after Helike vanished. It is almost certain that the sudden, catastrophic disappearance of a renowned Greek capital served as the direct, contemporary inspiration for a story of a civilization punished for its hubris. Helike is the historical kernel of truth that likely fueled the world's most enduring myth. But its most vital lesson is not for the past, but for the present. The geological forces that destroyed Helike have not ceased. Today, millions of people live in sprawling coastal cities built upon unstable sediments in seismically active zones across the globe. Helike stands as a 2,400-year-old warning, a precisely documented case study of how swiftly and completely our world can be reclaimed by the earth. It reminds us that the ground beneath our own feet may not be as solid as we choose to believe. The dust of millennia has settled over Helike, transforming a vibrant capital into a geological stratum, a data point in the long, violent story of the earth. Its rediscovery reminds us that our own foundations are not as firm as they seem. Cities, like memories, can sink into the earth, waiting for a future age to unearth their warnings and wonder at the lives that were.